Good morning. I would like to thank you for the invitation to the conference, and I want to begin directly with a capital question. The question is, what is truth in architecture, as architecture is recognized as an art? Can truth exist in art, in an activity based on representation? And if it can, where would we find it? In the represented object or in a possible faithfulness of representation? For architecture that has a strong scientific component, this issue becomes all the more thorny. The recourse to the certainty of science was often a way to provide a discipline with a foundation, a positive truth, according to which architecture coincided with the science of construction. The realm of science and construction conducted to certain and truth, but it also erases the specificity, the autonomy of architecture, its value and raison d'être. I would like to take you to the United States of America around the mid-19th century in a city that did not exist yet, but would be a reality within a few decades thanks to the commitment of a group of architects who successfully tackled the formal expression of its difficult construction, searching for a balance between scientific truth and artistic truth. This story I would like to tell you begins in October 1871. And this is a story of the birth of a proud city that, starting from a remote village of huts in a marshy and inhospitable site in the middle of the new continent, would become one of the richest, most productive, and still powerful cities in the world, Chicago. As the paradigm of America and its very recent history, the expression of its riches, dreams, and extreme contradictions, Chicago is a city where everything is amplified, everything is excess and contrast, both in nature and in man-made elements, heterogeneity, segregation, a crowd of buildings that gets rebuilt taller and taller in the endless mutual challenge and expanses of inexorably flat prairies, boundless suburbs that surround the city of skyscrapers, and a lake so mighty one cannot even see from shore to shore. In this story of construction of a new world, architecture plays a primary role. It is responsible of the birth of a new type of building, the skyscrapers, that emerges along with an idea of a city in deliberate contrast with the European one. The determination of its residents in shaping a face and an identity for the new civilization that was going to rise, and particularly the awareness of its architects in thinking that precisely the architecture of the new city would be responsible for representing this new nation in the eyes of the world, has kept these buildings from being merely technical achievements to become the extraordinary architectures we regard as the most authentic expression of the American city. In 1871, Chicago was completely destroyed by a violent fire that burnt on for days, spurred by the wind that through the region of the Great Lakes of the North blows onto the windy city. And like many other American cities that were damaged by fire during the same years, New York, New Orleans, Pittsburgh, San Francisco too, Chicago mostly comprised low building made of thin and cheap wooden joists, easily assembled into the rigid, light, and quickly buildable balloon frame. Chicago has been founded a few years before, in 1837, soon after the Midwestern territories had been annexed to the states of the Atlantic coast. The city was built over mud ground on the edge of endless prairies, looking out to the southern coast of Lake Michigan, where the small Fort Dearborn had been built as a defense against the Indians. In those years, the city bets its fate on the construction of a canal in order to establish one vast waterway network connecting the basins of the Great Lakes and of the Mississippi, that is the mighty river that crosses America from north to south, down to its delta in the Gulf of Mexico. The canal opened the traffic in 1847, followed in 1848 by the railway connecting the Midwestern city to other more established and populated cities in the East. In 1869, a few years later, the railway reached the Pacific coast, thereby connecting the two oceans. Placed at the intersection between the two major communication axes of the new continent, the north-south naval axis and the east-west railway axis, Chicago became the core of America, the hub of passage, gathering and sorting of trade for the entire territory of the United States. The settlement received a sudden and quick acceleration that turned it into a catalyzer of goods and capitals. At the end of the Civil War in 1866, Chicago became the major system of interior naval transportations in the world and the largest railway hub in the world. The deforestation of the northern regions provided the city with immense quantity of lumbers. The railway network carried livestock from all over America to what would eventually become the largest slaughterhouse district in the world, the stockyards. Equally immense quantity of cereals reached the city. The need to manufacture machinery would spur the mechanic industry, and so on, in a self-feeding chain. The residents of Chicago started to become aware of the potential of the new city and to nurture a civic spirit based on the pride of the enterprise they were going to accomplish.
Buongiorno, come ti posso...
More or less, at this point of the story, in 1871, the hood in Chicago went up in flames, erased in its physical body, but more vibrant and enterprising than ever in the spirit of its inhabitants. The construction of a city finally aware of its role and of the mission it would fulfill finally began. When around the beginning of the 19th century, the Midwestern territories were annexed to the first American states, President Jefferson suggested finding a simple system of land organization. Land was divided into square miles, plots, so that each city could be extended as desired and could spread out endless, as the city of Chicago in Illinois demonstrates, Hilbersheimer said when he was in the United States. Since its origin, Chicago grows by following this one law, by aggregating regular blocks around the first core placed at the intersection of the two branches of the river with the lake. And the only purpose of the American grid is the order subdivision of the land into easily sellable lots. In this way, the city expands according to the rule of profit and of the maximum exploitation of land. In Chicago, this law is inexorable. Therefore, the idea of developing high-rise building represents a special opportunity, particularly in terms of investment. The street becomes a void cut out into the compact and closely knit mass of building, a space from which the sky is almost invisible. After the Great Fire, many architects and engineers flock into the city to address the issue of the construction of this high-rise building. There are new functional, practical, constructional problems they are required to address, but the problem the architects of Chicago have to solve far exceeds for scope and importance the construction in itself difficult of a high-rise building. Their task is shaping the identity of an entire people with neither a common root nor a common language. In this sense, architecture plays a central role. It is the art primarily charged with the responsibility of giving a face to the new cities, of making this evolving culture recognizable, of expressing these values, the American city, a city without history, entirely to be built, particularly in the West and Midwest. The architects of Chicago will address the task of designing the new buildings for the city with the awareness of such civil responsibility by identifying their architectural research with the aspiration to shape the rising of American culture so that it can be recognized and proudly exhibited. The question the best architects of Chicago ask themselves is, how can we represent a high-rise office or commercial buildings? And what will it represent? Its structure, its interior organization, its nature, its character, and what is the true nature of an office building? The solutions provided in these years are the result of the pursuit of an expressive form for this new type of building. Architects are aware both of the extraordinary opportunities that affect their work and of the gap between technical and artistic issues, of the difference between the building's structure and its representation. The features of the first high-rise buildings are defined in a very short time. Cast iron and iron are the material that allow for the vertical expansion of the new buildings through a light and resistant frame. Mechanical equipment for the vertical transportation of people, system of foundations adapted for the city's marshy ground, bracing systems to resist the strong winds are developed for the occasion. But the arduous problem, that is the terror of the inhabitants of the windy city, the real threat for the new construction is still fire. An architect engineer stands out in these early challenges. He's a man from the East, having graduated in Cambridge in engineering, He also studied in Paris, then visited Europe, traveled across America, and during the Civil War built railways. William Le Baron Jenney arrives in Chicago in 1868, right before the Great Fire. And he is declared the authorship of the first high-rise building with a load-bearing frame entirely made of iron. Jenney becomes absorbed by the experimentation of iron frames, but besides developing a construction system that would become the standard practice in the construction of high-rise buildings, Le Baron Jenney very consciously wants to address the most difficult and important problem for an architect in Chicago. What are the forms to be used to represent this new achievement of construction technology to the world? In other words, what is the true nature of this building to be represented? The home insurance building earned Jenney the title of first builder of skyscrapers. He had been working for a long time at the skeleton frame, which comprises a rigid and light metal cage made of columns and beams tied together. This is a principle not so dissimilar from the wooden balloon frame. The plan is very simple, 42 for 30 meters rectangle with an interior courtyard for lighting, and the thin pilasters are distributed according to a regular grid, ordered and sized based on a rigidly structural logic, for a height of 9 stories plus 2 more added later. However, another element would allow Jenney to provide a shape to this elementary structure, a fire-resistant masonry cladding required to protect the building from fires. And it becomes a component, the cladding, as essential to the construction of the high-rise building as the iron frame. The home insurance building reflects the typical division of the structure into 2 sections: the lobby that acquires the role and image of a basement, and the office floors. The cladding differentiates the 2 sections. The building appears as a volume built with a pilaster system clad in stone at the 2 lower 2 floors and in brick at the upper floors. So if the masonry cladding reflects the need to protect the building from fires, and the pilaster's rhythm results from the iron frame, the form of such cladding, the intention to shape it as a trilithic structure of different orders, the hierarchy of such pilasters, the rhythm and measure are no longer the result of a technical reason, of a structural truth, but rather reflect an entirely different intention. The fire-resistant cladding becomes the tool to provide the building with an expressive image, to provide the volume with proportion, to articulate its parts and describes its elements, to achieve the narration of superposed floors that is a typical character of the new building, to represent its value, its very nature. This narration becomes the opportunity to achieve an important research about the expressiveness of architecture, the need to provide a stable, recognizable form to its constitutive elements. For Jenney, technical and expressive research must go hand to hand. Before the home insurance building, Jenney had employed the iron construction system in a smaller first lighter building, later demolished. That is a simple block of 5 stories only and a rectangular plan. Here, the structure is still mixed with wooden planks for the floor, and the outer masonry pilasters are actually a second structure bearing its own load that is connected to the iron frame which bears the building's load. In this case, too, Jenney uses the fire-resistant brick cladding in order to describe the volume of the building and its typical features, the superposition of stories and the brightness of the interior. He describes the simple volume through a trilytic order of superposed slabs that does not coincide fully with the rhythm of the interior supports. In order to provide proportion to their size, he divided the wide base through a second order of small pilasters that originates the tripartite division of the windows. That is a typical feature of, will become a typical feature of the Chicago windows. The elements are described in an analytic way, clearly separated in their role through string courses and cornices, and articulated into decreasing high orders. The technical construction system, not safe enough to remain exposed to the fire, as well as insufficiently expressive to be exhibited directly, suggests the principle for the definition of the volume and its elements. This reflects Jenney's concern about being clear and explicit, Jenney says, and the declared intention to pursue a principle of truth in architecture. A principle of truth understood not in a strictly positive sense, as a coincidence between architectural and structural forms, but as a principle of coherence and correspondence between the essential features of the building and the forms that represent it. The entire building must be true, says Jenney, and correspond to its own nature, considering this correspondence to the nature of things as a moral duty, a duty Louis Sullivan would reiterate even more clearly later on. The form of the building cannot be simply the expression of its structure, as architecture cannot be in any way directly construction. Structure suggests, however, a possibility. It implies that architecture may be expressed through the narration of structure, through the representation of its constitutional principle. The iron frame structure from which the high-rise building derives its typical features must be enriched in formal terms with the ability to become evident, to become eloquent, to become manifest. This pursuit of expressiveness represents the purpose of art, the real task of architecture. Art, says Jenney, must be used in order to underline construction in a way that reinforces this correspondence, while confirming also the separation between technical aspects and expressive requirements of the building. Architecture, says Jenney, is the art of building in a sincere and decorative way, and argues that decorations should arise naturally from the construction and the constructive idea be carried out in every detail, because an architect is a building artist. Even in the second lighter building, perhaps his most refined and meaningful work, this is still existing, Jenney pursues this orientation. The second lighter is a large rectangular commercial volume built on a grid of iron pilasters, where the only indication provided in the plan concern the position of stairs and elevators. In this case, too, the image the building presents to the city is the shape of the stone cladding, that is granite of Maine in this case, which becomes an eloquent narration of the structure, pursued and shown in every detail. This is a representation of the constructional idea that makes it possible. This decoration is responsible for the definition of the volume, the distinction of its elements, the hinted basement, the rhythm and the powerful corner pilasters that establish the boundaries of the volume, the entablature on the top, the building's volume, its partition into bays through giant order pilasters, the superposition of stories with thinner pilasters, the partition of the windows, and so on and so on. Jenney shapes the elements by conferring an explicit role to each in this constructional narration, because, he says, stability must necessarily be an effective as well as an apparent quality of building. An excess of strength must be represented in order to satisfy the mind. The builder must show stability. Merely providing the building with a good technical construction is not enough for Jenney. Art requires the narration of such construction. It requires that solidity, that is an essential condition for architecture, be made evident, be made exhibited. The representation of construction becomes the principle that shapes the construction of the high-rise building. Its expressive, appropriate form, what confers dignity and decorum. This is the truth of architecture, a represented truth. For Jenney, the correspondence and the distance between truth of construction and its representation, a gap entirely included in the form of the elements, encapsulated the expressive power and the artistic quality of architecture. A truth that, belong not absolute, requires a shift in order to be understood and appreciated. This shift, deriving from the pursuit of an appropriate representation of the nature of the building, is what contains, for Jenney, the truth of architecture. Thank you very much.